Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today, what we're gonna talk about is how the cervical spine impacts throwing mechanics, okay? So pretty frequently when we're talking about kind of health and impacts on kind of the delivery itself, people wanna automatically kind of look at the shoulder and the elbow, and these are all worthwhile things, right? Metrics like kind of cuff strength through external or internal rotation, or grip strength, or specific measurements through pronation, supination, ulnar or radial deviation. All of these things are very worthwhile measures, but we're often ignoring kind of this key part in the chain, which is the cervical spine or the neck. So we're gonna kind of go through that today. Okay, so let's talk about the anatomy of the cervical spine. So we have 7 vertebrae, right? C1 through C7. And we've got 2 facets per vertebrae, right? And they articulate with the facets above and below. So we've got a lot of joint surfaces where funky stuff can happen and things can go wrong, okay? In addition to that, we got discs between these vertebrae and they provide space for nerves to move through. All right, so we have 8 nerve roots that are coming from the cervical spine, okay? And so what this kind of means is that any issues in here can have impact on these nerve roots and can have some pretty significant downstream effects on kind of other structures, right? Which we'll get to in a second. Okay, so when we talk about the anatomy, kind of the range of motion that we're looking for from the cervical spine, one of the common tests that we can do that there is kind of literature behind in terms of how this impacts other things is the flexion rotation test. So essentially, right, can you turn your head to the side? And can you reach it forward so that your chin would go somewhere near your collarbone, right? So kind of the minimum that we're looking for is about 39 degrees of flexion rotation. And kind of one of the available papers on this showed that athletes with less than 39 degrees were 9 times more likely to miss games that year. So it's kind of a really important stat. So one of the really important things to kind of note here is that restrictions here can cause nerve problems that impact us kind of elsewhere, right? Think, you know, shoulder and elbow and things like that. So this is a really important thing to kind of look at when we're discussing issues elsewhere and how an athlete is moving. So one of the common kind of compensations seen at the cervical spine is if we have reduced range of motion in kind of that upper cervical region, we're gonna need more range somewhere else, right? So we're gonna get it generally from the mid-cervical region. And what can kind of happen here is then we have less space for nerve roots to kind of move through. And so then we do tend to see, per the literature, kind of issues downstream at the shoulder. Okay, so how do kind of limitations in range of motion at the cervical spine impact us on the mechanical side? So we're talking about a couple of different elements and we'll talk about kind of specific impacts there. So if we think about layback, this is kind of the first piece we're gonna talk about. Layback is essentially 3 elements, right? So it's a T-spine extension, right? It's scapular posterior tilt, and then it's glenohumeral external rotation. We need these 3 pieces to kind of work together to kind of maximize that layback. So what they found in the Thigpen et al. Study is essentially that when forward head posture was increased, it impacted scapular kinematics, okay? And so the way that it impacted this is essentially when people were performing overhead tasks, they had greater anterior tilt of the scapula. So think about it kind of tipping forward. And so this meant 2 things. One, they're obviously we're gonna have trouble kind of getting to that posterior tilted position to kind of impact layback in a positive way. And then 2, in overhead tasks, we also saw a greater kind of incidence of subacromial impingement as well. And they also saw less serratus anterior activation. That's important for upward rotation, protraction, these kinds of things obviously are super relevant for throwing. So not only are we seeing kind of range of motion impacts, but we're seeing muscular activation results as well. So super important to kind of nail this down when we talk about kind of range of motion at the cervical spine. Okay, so what's the impact on hip-shoulder separation potentially, okay? So let's think about what hip-shoulder separation is, right? Essentially, it's the timing difference between when kind of pelvic rotational angular velocity is maximized, and then same deal at the upper torso, okay? What we know kind of from the research is that torso rotational angular velocity is going to be a major impact on ball velocity, right? It's an important factor. And the way we kind of maximize that is, do we have something to anchor against to kind of get a stretch across that connective tissue to then aggressively fire through? All right, so timing becomes super important. Exactly how far you have to go to get this, we talked about this before, is gonna be kind of highly individual. But if we don't kind of maximize that stretch and kind of pull that rubber band as far as it's gonna go, we're not gonna kind of maximize the elastic return from it as well, okay? So when we think about what's happening here, we're gonna need a lot from that cervical spine to be able to kind of counter-rotate the upper body while kind of keeping the head rotated towards the plate while we're going through this. So we use golf as a proxy because there isn't really a ton of research on this in baseball. About 70 degrees or a little bit more on each side is what's required to kind of maximize or not have it impact negatively that torso counter rotation. All right, so we know that we need about that much. And so if that doesn't happen, we may see a couple of things. One, reduced counter rotation of the torso. Two, it may pull us out of that counter rotation a little bit early. Or three, it may kind of throw us off with like a big head whip or a lot of head movement where we're gonna throw off the vestibular system. And so we're not gonna have that kind of stability, the body's not gonna feel that safety where we can maximize output, and we're gonna kind of get that governor put back on us, and it's gonna reduce output along with kind of changing some patterning things in all likelihood. But we really wanna make sure we kind of have this kind of range of motion in order to kind of not cause problems downstream like we're talking about with hip-shoulder separation. Okay, so kind of the final piece we're going to talk about today on the mechanical side is going to be how forward head posture impacts our ability to kind of upwardly rotate. So upward rotation is important for a few reasons. One, kind of getting the arm up, right? So we got the elbow at about shoulder height is going to put us kind of where that pec's line of pull is, right about 90 degrees. So we can maximize what we're going to get from that, knowing that the pec and the lat are kind of the two main accelerators of the arm. That's super important from like a performance side of things. Second, when we go through ball release, right, we need kind of protraction and upward rotation to be happening through there. Those distraction forces at the shoulder are pretty extreme. And if we don't have the ability to kind of get there, we're gonna get a lot more stress going through the bicep and the rotator cuff, which can be problematic from like a health standpoint and kind of what that can actually handle. And then kind of third, right, when we see that upward rotation reduced, we're still ultimately probably gonna be able to about get where we need to get from a kind of gross positional standpoint, all right? But the way we do it is gonna be a little bit different. So rather than kind of having that upward rotation and kind of that ball and socket congruency, what's gonna happen is we're gonna compress that subacromial space because that humerus is gonna move a bit more superiorly, right? So we can have problems there, kind of like we talked about earlier with that subacromial impingement and other issues along those lines. So if we have these, we kind of talked about a couple different range of motion issues, whether it's flexion rotation or forward head posture or all of these things, how does it impact our mechanics and potential to kind of not only perform at a high level, but stay on the field? Okay, so let's talk about some lifestyle factors to kind of consider when we're talking about, you know, any of these cervical spine issues. So one is going to be kind of breathing mechanics. All right, if we're always breathing through our mouth, we're going to be kind of operating in a sympathetic kind of mode, and so we're going to get some of these accessory kind of breathing muscles turned on, like the upper traps, the SCM, those kinds of things. So thinking about nasal breathing and being in that parasympathetic state is going to be an important piece of the puzzle as well. Pillow height is another one. We don't want that huge pillow kind of pushing us into forward head posture. That can be problematic. Sleeping position is another one. There's some research to kind of show that if we're sleeping in the overhead position, we're going to get, you know, much higher activation levels of the upper traps and the levators. And so things like this, and then kind of how you're sitting, viewing screens, that kind of thing, resting posture, are all important pieces to this. A minor one maybe is kind of head position, you know, with things such as deadlifts and other things. Keeping that kind of packed neck posture can be helpful for some people if they're really having problems with this. Okay, so if you're having issues with cervical spine, kind of where would we start? So I think with some kind of gentle releases would be the first spot with some of the problematic areas that we discussed. So one would be upper traps, doing some release for that. Two would be levator scapula and release for that. Three could be an SCM pin and stretch. We're going to want to be pretty gentle with this one. And then our final piece would be our cervical rotation progression that we would kind of have guys go through, and this will be kind of playing here while I'm talking. But kind of going through a lot of these kind of gentle modalities and bringing some attention to this area, and kind of a daily practice of kind of getting better with some of these gritty spots and maybe restricted areas can be a really helpful piece kind of going forward, because I think this is an underutilized or maybe under-attended to area of the body when it comes to pain, mechanical issues, all of these things. Thanks for watching. If you got any questions, feel free to drop them below. If you want to learn more about remote training, feel free to reach out to us via email. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.